The stallion reared so high that 4 grooms scattered across the yard, and one of them did not get up fast enough. His scream cut through the morning air, and every servant on the estate ran toward the stables. Duke Alexander Ashworth arrived just in time to see the injured man carried away, blood soaking through his sleeve, and the black horse still thrashing against the ropes that barely held him. "Get him out of my sight," Alexander said, meaning the horse, though his voice was so cold that for a moment the stable master thought he meant the wounded groom. "My lord, we have tried everything," the stable master said, wiping sweat from his forehead. 3 trainers, 3 failures. This horse will kill someone before the month is out. Then sell him. He is Lord Edward's horse, my lord. The words landed like a blow. Alexander's jaw tightened. His younger brother had been dead for 8 months, thrown from a different horse on a hunting trail, and Tempest was the last living thing that still carried Edward's scent, his temperament, his memory. Selling him would mean letting go of something Alexander was not ready to release, no matter how much damage the animal caused. "Then find someone who can handle him," Alexander said. "I do not care how. I want this solved by week's end." He turned and walked back toward the house, his boots striking the gravel with sharp, impatient steps. Word of the Duke's fury spread through the village by nightfall, twisted and exaggerated the way stories always are among servants and shopkeepers. By morning, half the county knew that the Duke of Ashworth was offering a reward to anyone who could tame his wild stallion, and the other half knew that 3 grown men had already failed and been injured trying. Charlotte Whitmore heard the story from the baker's wife while buying the last loaf of bread her coins could afford that week. She listened without much interest until the woman mentioned the size of the reward, and then she stopped walking altogether. "How much did you say?" "Enough to feed a family for half a year, my dear, though I would not go near that beast for twice the sum. They say he nearly killed a man yesterday." Charlotte thanked her and walked home slowly, her mind working faster than her feet. Her family's name had been dragged through scandal 2 years earlier when her father's business partner vanished with half their fortune, and left my father to take the blame in every drawing room from here to London. Since then, doors had closed to the Whitmores one by one. Invitations stopped arriving. Old friends found reasons to be busy whenever Charlotte's mother called. The money that reward promised could keep them fed through winter, could pay the debts that kept her mother awake at night, and Charlotte was not afraid of a horse. She had spent her childhood in her uncle's stables in the countryside, before her father's ambition moved them to town, and she understood animals better than she understood most people. Her mother did not want her to go. "A duke will not listen to a woman, Charlotte. He will laugh you off his land before you say 2 words. "Then let him laugh," Charlotte said, tying her bonnet with steady hands. "I would rather be laughed at than watch you go without heat this winter." The Ashworth estate stood at the edge of the village, its iron gates taller than anything Charlotte had approached in years. She walked up the long drive with her chin high, ignoring the stares of gardeners and stable hands, who paused their work to watch the strange woman march toward the main stable as though she owned it. She found the Duke exactly where the villagers said he would be, standing outside the largest stall, arms crossed, watching a groom attempt and fail to even approach the horse inside. "I am here about the stallion," Charlotte said. Alexander turned, and whatever he expected to see, it was not a young woman in a plain wool coat with mud already staining the hem of her dress from the walk. He looked her over once, quickly, the way a man looks at something he has already decided is not worth his time. "You are lost." "I am not." "Then you misunderstood. I am not looking for a governess or a seamstress. I need someone who can handle a dangerous animal." "I understood perfectly," Charlotte said. "I am here to tame your horse." For a moment Alexander said nothing. Then he laughed, short and humorless, and the sound made Charlotte's spine stiffen with anger rather than embarrassment. "You will get yourself killed. That is my concern, not yours. It becomes my concern the moment it happens on my property." He turned to the stable master. "Escort her out." "I have handled difficult horses before," Charlotte said quickly, before the stable master could take her arm. "One's far more dangerous than this. I do not need your permission to try, only your gate left open." Alexander studied her again, longer this time, and something in her steady gaze made him pause. She did not flinch under his stare the way most people did. She did not look away or soften her posture to appear smaller, more agreeable. It irritated him, and beneath the irritation, though he would not have admitted it, something else stirred as well. "You have 5 minutes," he said. "If he so much as looks at you wrong, you leave and never return." 5 minutes will not be enough to earn his trust," Charlotte said, "but it will be enough to prove I am not a fool." She did not wait for his response. She walked toward the stall slowly, her steps unhurried, her hands loose at her sides. The stallion inside threw his head and stamped, ears pinned flat, but Charlotte did not stop moving forward, and she did not speak. She had learned long ago that frightened animals did not need words. They needed calm and patience, and someone who understood that fear looked the same in a horse as it did in a person, whether it showed itself as violence or silence. She stopped several feet from the stall door and simply stood there, breathing slowly, letting the horse look at her without demanding anything in return. Behind her, she heard Alexander shift his weight, impatient already, though he said nothing. The minutes passed. The stallion's ears flicked toward her once, then away, then toward her again. Slowly, his stamping eased. His nostrils flared as he caught her scent, unfamiliar and unthreatening. "Time," Alexander said, though his voice had lost some of its sharp edge. Charlotte did not move yet. "He has not tried to hurt me," she said quietly. "That should tell you something. It tells me he has not decided yet." "No," she said, finally stepping back and turning to face him. "It tells me that everyone who has approached him so far came in fear, or in anger, or in a hurry to prove something. He can feel all of that before they even touch the gate. I came in patience." He noticed the difference. Alexander's expression did not soften, not exactly, but the sharp line of his jaw eased just slightly, and Charlotte thought she saw something flicker behind his eyes, something closer to curiosity than dismissal. "You have 2 weeks," he said finally. "If the horse is not manageable by then, you leave, and you do not return to this property again. And if I succeed? Then you will have earned your reward, and my gratitude, though I doubt gratitude is worth much to you." "It is worth more than you think," Charlotte said, and something in her voice made him look at her once more before he turned and walked away, leaving her alone at the stable door with a wild horse, and a challenge she intended to win. That night, walking home under a sky heavy with clouds, Charlotte allowed herself a small, tired smile. She had not expected kindness from the Duke, and she had not received any, but she had earned 2 weeks, and 2 weeks was enough time to prove that a woman with patience and steady hands could succeed where 3 trained men had failed. She thought of her mother's worried face, of the empty coal bin waiting at home, and she quickened her steps, already planning how she would approach the stallion again at first light, before the household woke, before anyone could tell her she did not belong there. She did not yet know that the horse would be the easiest part of what waited for her at Ashworth Estate. The Duke's cold eyes had held something more complicated than doubt, something that unsettled her more than the stallion's temper ever could, though she would not understand it fully until much later, when it was far too late to walk away. Charlotte arrived at the stable before the sun had fully risen, when mist still clung low to the grass, and the household was just beginning to stir. She had told no one at home about the exact hour she planned to start, only that she would return by evening, and she had spent most of the night thinking through every method she remembered from her uncle's stables, sorting through which ones might work on a horse that had already learned to associate people with pain and restraint. The stable master, a broad man named Hale with gray at his temples and doubt written across his face, was already there when she arrived, mucking out a stall 2 doors down from Tempest's. "You came back," he said, not quite hiding his surprise. "I said I would." "Most people say a great many things they do not mean, miss." "I am not most people," Charlotte said, setting down the small bag she had brought, filled with nothing more than a soft brush, a handful of oats, and a length of rope she had no intention of using unless the horse allowed it. "Has he eaten this morning?" "Barely touched his feed. He has been agitated since the accident. Will not let anyone near enough to check if his leg troubles him." Charlotte frowned. "No one has looked at his leg?" "No one has gotten close enough to try." She approached the stall the way she had the day before, slow and unhurried, letting the stallion see her before she made any move toward the gate. His ears flicked at the sound of her voice, low and even, and though he stamped once, he did not retreat to the far corner the way he had with every other visitor. "Good morning," she said softly, as though speaking to a person rather than an animal. "I am not here to hurt you. I only want to understand what happened." She spent nearly an hour simply standing near the stall, speaking in that same low voice, offering nothing, demanding nothing, until the stallion's stamping slowed and his head lowered slightly, no longer held high and tense with alarm. When she finally opened the gate, Hale sucked in a sharp breath behind her, certain he was about to witness another disaster. But Charlotte moved with such deliberate calm that the horse only watched her, muscles coiled but not lashing out, as she stepped inside and stood still, letting him decide when to close the distance between them. It took another 20 minutes before Tempest took one hesitant step forward and lowered his nose to sniff at her outstretched palm. "There," Charlotte whispered. "That was not so difficult, was it?" By the time Alexander arrived at the stable, drawn by curiosity he refused to name, he found Charlotte standing beside the stallion with her hand resting gently along his neck, and the horse standing calm, ears relaxed, as though he had never thrown a groom or torn through his stall in a rage. Alexander stopped several feet away, unwilling to disturb the moment, and found himself staring longer than he intended. "How?" he said finally, not quite a question, more an accusation. Charlotte glanced over her shoulder, unsurprised to see him there. "Time, patience, the willingness to let him make the first move instead of forcing my own. My trainers tried patience. Your trainers tried patience while expecting a result within the hour. That is not patience. That is impatience wearing a slower disguise." She turned back to the horse, running her hand along his flank, and Alexander noted, with some irritation, that the observation struck rather close to describing himself. "He has not let anyone examine his leg," Alexander said. "Hale mentioned an injury. I noticed him favoring it slightly. Would you like to see?" Alexander hesitated at the stall door, uncertain whether his presence would undo the fragile trust Charlotte had built in a single morning. But she beckoned him forward with a small nod, and against every instinct that told him to remain at a cautious distance, he stepped inside. "Move slowly," she said quietly, "and do not look him directly in the eye until he is used to you." Horses read confidence differently than we expect. Too much, too fast, and it becomes a threat. Alexander did as she instructed, moving with a care that felt foreign to him, a man used to commanding rooms and estates and having his orders obeyed without delay. The stallion's ears flicked toward him, wary, but Charlotte's steady presence beside the animal seemed to anchor him, and he allowed the Duke to approach close enough to see the slight swelling along his front leg. "Not broken," Charlotte said, crouching carefully to look closer, "but bruised, likely from the struggle during the accident. It will heal with rest, provided no one tries to force him into a saddle before then. You know a great deal about horses for someone who arrived at my gate on foot, with mud on her hem." Charlotte's chin lifted slightly at the comment, sensing the challenge folded inside it. "My uncle kept a stable of nearly 20 horses when I was young. I spent more hours there than in any drawing room. I suppose you assumed I learned my skills from a book." "I assumed nothing," Alexander said, though the faint color rising at his collar suggested otherwise. "I am simply surprised." "You seem a man often surprised by things that should not surprise him at all." He looked at her sharply, and for a moment, Charlotte wondered if she had pushed too far, spoken too freely to a man who held her family's fragile fortunes in the balance of his opinion. But instead of anger, something almost like amusement crossed his face, quickly hidden, though not quickly enough that she missed it. "You are impertinent," he said. "I am honest. There is often little difference between the two in my experience, especially to men unused to hearing it." Over the following days, Charlotte returned each morning before the sun fully rose, and each evening she left only once the light had faded too much to see clearly. She worked with Tempest slowly, teaching him to accept a halter without flinching, then a lead rope, then eventually the gentle weight of a blanket across his back. Progress came in small, hard-won pieces, and each piece felt like a victory worth savoring. Alexander began appearing at the stable more often than his schedule strictly required, telling himself it was merely to monitor his investment in the horse, though even he found the explanation growing thinner with each visit. Their conversations sharpened with each meeting, neither willing to concede ground easily. Charlotte questioned his methods with the estate staff, the way he expected instant obedience without explanation. Alexander questioned her insistence on patience over discipline, arguing that some creatures, human or animal, required a firmer hand. Beneath the arguments, though, something else was forming, quiet and unacknowledged, a current neither of them named aloud. The turning point came on a gray afternoon, when Charlotte was fitting a new lead rope to Tempest's halter, and the horse, startled by a sudden crack of thunder in the distance, reared without warning. Charlotte stumbled backward, losing her footing on the damp straw, and before she could catch herself, Alexander's arms were around her, pulling her clear of the stallion's path just as his hooves came down where she had been standing. For a moment neither of them moved. Charlotte's back pressed against his chest, his arms still locked firmly around her, both of them breathing hard, more from the sudden nearness than from the fright itself. She could feel the rapid beat of his heart against her shoulder blade, could smell the faint scent of cedar and rain on his coat, and when she finally turned within the circle of his arms to look up at him, the careful distance they had maintained for days seemed to dissolve entirely. "You are unhurt," he said. his voice lower than she had heard it before, stripped of its usual sharp command. "Thanks to you," Charlotte managed, aware suddenly of how close his face was to hers, how his eyes, which she had thought so cold on their first meeting, now seemed to hold something warmer, something searching. Neither moved to step back. The stallion, sensing the shift in the air, quieted himself in the corner of the stall, watching the two humans with something almost like patience of his own. It was Alexander who finally broke the moment, releasing her slowly, though his hands lingered a beat longer than necessary at her shoulders. "You should be more careful," he said, though the words carried none of the sharpness they might have held a week earlier. "I am always careful," Charlotte said, straightening her coat, willing her voice to remain steady, though her heart refused to slow. "Sometimes circumstances are simply beyond anyone's control." "Yes," Alexander said quietly, looking at her in a way that made her wonder if he spoke only of the horse. "I am beginning to understand that." He left the stable shortly after, offering no further explanation, and Charlotte stood alone with Tempest for a long while, her hand resting against the horse's warm neck, trying to steady thoughts that had grown far more complicated than she had ever intended them to become when she first walked through the estate gates seeking nothing more than a reward to save her family from ruin. Word of Charlotte's presence at the Ashworth estate did not stay contained within the stable walls for long. Servants talked among themselves, and servants talked to shopkeepers, and shopkeepers talked to anyone who would listen, until by the end of the first week, half the village knew that the disgraced Whitmore girl was spending her mornings alone with the Duke's dangerous horse, and more than a few tongues wondered aloud what else she might be spending her mornings doing. Charlotte heard the whispers first from a maid named Louisa, who worked in the estate's kitchen, and had taken a liking to her during the long hours she spent waiting for Tempest's feed to be prepared. "They are saying unkind things in the village, miss," Louisa said one morning, keeping her voice low as she handed Charlotte a small bucket of oats. "About your family, about why a duke would allow someone like you onto his land." "Someone like me," Charlotte repeated, feeling the familiar sting of the words even though she had braced herself for them the moment she accepted this work. "You mean someone whose father was made a fool by a dishonest partner? I mean no offense, miss. I only thought you should know what is being said, so it does not catch you unprepared." Charlotte thanked her, though the warning settled uneasily in her stomach for the rest of the day. She had grown used to whispers in town, the way conversations quieted when she entered a shop, the way invitations that once arrived weekly had stopped coming altogether after her father's scandal broke. She had told herself she no longer cared what people said. But hearing that the rumors had followed her here, onto ground where she had finally begun to feel some measure of purpose and worth, cut deeper than she expected. The rumors reached Alexander by evening, delivered not gently by a sympathetic maid, but bluntly by his aunt, Lady Beatrice, who arrived unannounced at the estate with the clear intention of delivering a lecture. "You cannot be serious, Alexander," she said, settling into a chair in his study, without waiting for an invitation. "A Whitmore, working your stables like a common groom. Do you have any notion what people are saying?" "I have some notion, yes. Her father ruined half the investors who trusted him. The family name is worth less than the mud on her shoes. And you allow her to wander your property freely, alone, unchaperoned, for hours at a time. She is taming a horse 3 trained men could not manage," Alexander said, his patience thinning with every word his aunt spoke. "Her presence here has nothing to do with her father's failures. It has everything to do with them, whether you wish to see it or not. People will assume the worst, Alexander. They already have, and a man in your position cannot afford careless assumptions attaching themselves to his name, not with the Ashworth title still recovering from your brother's death, and all the questions that followed it." The mention of Edward struck harder than Lady Beatrice likely intended, and Alexander's expression darkened. "Leave my brother out of this conversation. I only mean that the family cannot survive another scandal so soon after the last one. You must think of your position, of the responsibilities that fall to you now that you are the only Ashworth left to carry them." Alexander said nothing further, though long after his aunt departed, her words continued to circle through his thoughts, tangled together with images of Charlotte's steady hands calming a frightened animal, her sharp replies that never once wavered under his scrutiny, the warmth of her against him in the stable when he had pulled her clear of danger without thinking, only reacting. He found her the following evening exactly where he expected, brushing Tempest's coat by lantern light, long after most of the household had retired. She looked up when he entered, and something in his expression must have betrayed the weight of his afternoon, because her own face shifted immediately to concern. "Something is troubling you," she said. "Rumors. About you. About your presence here. My aunt seems to believe your family's misfortune will somehow attach itself to mine, simply because you spend your mornings in my stable. Charlotte's hand stilled against Tempest's flank. I imagined as much would happen eventually. It always does. You do not seem surprised. I have had 2 years to grow accustomed to how quickly people decide who I am based on my father's mistakes, rather than anything I have done myself. Her voice carried no self-pity, only a tired honesty that struck Alexander harder than any argument could have. If my presence here troubles you, I will understand if you wish me to finish my work at different hours, away from prying eyes. That is not what I want, Alexander said, more forcefully than he intended, and Charlotte looked up at him, startled by the sudden heat in his voice. Then what do you want? He hesitated, the question hanging between them longer than either expected. I want you to understand that I do not care what my aunt believes, or what the village whispers behind closed doors. You have accomplished in 1 week what 3 trained men could not manage in a month. That matters more to me than idle gossip. Careful, Charlotte said softly, though a small, unguarded smile touched her lips for the first time since he had entered. You are beginning to sound almost kind. Do not grow accustomed to it. I would not dream of it, she said, though the warmth in her voice suggested otherwise, and for a moment, the tension of the day eased between them, replaced by something gentler, something neither was quite ready to name. Later that evening, once Alexander had returned to the house and Charlotte remained alone with Tempest for a final check before locking the stable for the night, she allowed herself to sit on an overturned crate near his stall, and finally speak the truth she had carried silently since her father's ruin 2 years earlier. You would understand, wouldn't you? She murmured to the horse, who nosed gently at her shoulder as though listening. Being blamed for things beyond your control, being looked at and judged before anyone bothers to ask what actually happened. She thought of the long nights watching her mother count coins by candlelight, of the cold winter 2 years past when they had burned old letters for warmth because coal had grown too dear, of the quiet desperation that drove her through the Ashworth gates in the first place. I did not come here for a reward, not truly. I came here because I needed something in my life to make sense again, something I could fix with my own 2 hands instead of watching helplessly while everything crumbled around me. She did not know that Alexander had returned briefly, forgetting his gloves on a nearby hook, and had paused at the stable door long enough to hear every word. He said nothing, retreating quietly into the darkness before she noticed him, though her words settled somewhere deep in his chest, alongside his own grief for Edward, his own guilt over a temper that had grown sharper and colder since his brother's death, his own quiet desperation to feel something other than duty and loss. That night, for the first time since his brother's funeral, Alexander sat alone in his study and allowed himself to grieve properly. Tears he had refused himself for 8 long months finally breaking free in the privacy of an empty room. He thought of Edward's laughter, of the reckless joy his brother had always carried into every room, of how different Tempest had been under Edward's hand, calm and eager rather than wild with fear. He understood suddenly why the horse had grown so unmanageable after the accident. Grief did strange things to creatures who did not have words to explain their pain, whether they walked on 2 legs or 4. The following morning, Alexander appeared at the stable earlier than usual, finding Charlotte already there, feeding Tempest his morning oats. I wanted to thank you, he said, and Charlotte turned, surprised by the softness in his tone. For what? For seeing something in this horse that I could not. For reminding me, without meaning to, that grief does not excuse cruelty, even when it explains anger. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Edward would have liked you, I think. He never had patience for people who dismissed others too quickly. It was one of his better qualities, one I have not always managed to inherit. Charlotte's expression softened at the mention of his brother, understanding immediately the weight behind his words. Tell me about him, if you would like to. And so, standing together in the quiet stable while Tempest ate peacefully beside them, Alexander spoke of his brother for the first time since the funeral, sharing memories he had kept locked away out of fear that speaking them aloud would make the loss more real. Charlotte listened without interruption, offering nothing but her full attention, and by the time he finished, something had shifted permanently between them, a bond forged not through careless words or stolen glances but through shared vulnerability, honest and unguarded. Neither spoke of what it meant, but both felt it, settling quietly into place, impossible now to ignore. 10 days into Charlotte's work, Tempest allowed a saddle to rest on his back for the first time since the accident that had injured the groom. Charlotte moved with careful slowness, murmuring low reassurances as she tightened the girth, watching every flick of his ears for any sign of the panic that had once defined him. He shifted once, uneasy, but did not rear, did not bolt, and when she finally settled her weight into the saddle, he simply stood, muscles tense but controlled, waiting for her signal rather than fighting against it. Hale, watching from the stable entrance, called out for Alexander before Charlotte had even completed her first slow circuit of the paddock. By the time Alexander arrived, breathless from hurrying across the yard, Charlotte had guided Tempest into an easy trot, her hands light on the reins, her posture relaxed in a way that spoke of complete trust between horse and rider. Alexander stopped at the paddock fence and simply watched, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest at the sight before him. This was Edward's horse, moving with the same easy grace he remembered from years past, before grief and violence had twisted the animal into something unrecognizable. And there, guiding him gently back to that grace, was a woman who had walked onto his estate with nothing but mud on her hem and steel in her spine, refusing to be dismissed no matter how coldly he had first treated her. "You did it," he said, when Charlotte finally brought Tempest to a stop near the fence, both of them slightly breathless, both of them smiling in a way neither could suppress. "We did it," Charlotte corrected, patting the horse's neck fondly. "He deserves the credit as much as I do. He simply needed someone willing to wait long enough to earn it." Alexander opened the paddock gate and stepped inside, closing the distance between them with purposeful steps. Charlotte dismounted, handing the reins to Hale, and turned to find Alexander standing closer than she expected, his expression unguarded in a way she had rarely seen. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for how I treated you that first day. I judged you before you had the chance to prove anything, and I was wrong to do so." "You were," Charlotte agreed, though without malice, a teasing note creeping into her voice. "But I forgave you somewhere around the third day, when you started bringing Tempest carrots instead of simply inspecting his progress from a distance." Alexander's mouth curved into something rare, an unguarded smile that transformed his usually stern features entirely. "You noticed that." "I notice a great many things, Your Grace." "Alexander," he said quietly, "I think, after everything, you have earned the right to use my given name." The air between them grew charged with something neither had spoken aloud, though both felt its weight pressing forward, demanding acknowledgement. Alexander reached up, tucking a loose strand of hair behind Charlotte's ear with a gentleness that startled them both, his fingers lingering against her cheek a moment longer than necessary. "Charlotte," he said, her name unfamiliar and wonderful on his tongue, "I find that I have become entirely unable to imagine my mornings without you in them." Before Charlotte could answer, the sound of an approaching carriage broke the moment apart, and both turned to see an unfamiliar vehicle rolling up the estate drive. Alexander's expression shifted immediately to something more guarded, and Charlotte felt the warmth of the moment slip away as quickly as it had arrived. "Edmund?" Alexander muttered, recognizing the crest on the carriage door. "You know him?" "Edmund Caro, a gentleman of modest fortune who has, on more than one occasion, expressed interest in courting suitable young ladies of good standing, regardless of how thin their family's remaining reputation might be." Alexander's tone carried an edge Charlotte had not heard from him in days. "I did not realize he was acquainted with your family." "He is not truly. My mother mentioned him once, years ago, before everything changed. I am surprised he remembers my name at all." But Edmund Caro, stepping down from his carriage with practiced charm, remembered Charlotte's name quite well, and had in fact come specifically in search of her, having heard through village gossip that the Whitmore girl had found unexpected favor at the Ashworth estate. "Miss Whitmore," he said, bowing with exaggerated politeness. "What a fortunate surprise finding you here. I had hoped to call on your mother this week, but learning you were at the estate, I thought I might extend my greetings in person." Charlotte, caught between confusion and the lingering warmth of her conversation with Alexander, offered a polite but reserved greeting. Edmund, undeterred by her cool reception, launched into a lengthy account of his recent travels and his growing fortune, clearly angling toward a courtship Charlotte had never invited and did not welcome. Alexander watched the exchange with a stillness that belied the tightness gathering in his chest. He told himself the reaction was nothing more than concern for a friend, a colleague, whose reputation he had come to respect. But when Edmund reached for Charlotte's hand to press a lingering kiss against her knuckles, something sharp and possessive flared through Alexander that he could not fully explain away. "Mr. Caro," Alexander said, his voice carrying an authority that made Edmund straighten immediately. "Miss Whitmore is currently engaged in important work for this estate. I am certain her time is better spent attending to it than entertaining social calls during working hours." "Of course, Your Grace," Edmund said, though his eyes lingered on Charlotte a moment longer than propriety allowed. Perhaps I might call on her at a more suitable hour instead. Miss Whitmore, might I have your permission to visit properly, once your duties here have concluded for the day? Charlotte hesitated, aware of Alexander's tense posture beside her, aware too of her own conflicted feelings, unable to fully explain why Edmund's attention, which 2 years earlier might have offered a welcome path toward securing her family's future, now felt entirely unwelcome compared to the quiet understanding she had built with Alexander over these past days. I appreciate your interest, Mr. Caro, she said carefully, though my responsibilities here occupy most of my time and attention at present. Edmund's smile flickered, though he recovered quickly, offering a final bow before returning to his carriage, promising to call again soon regardless of her polite deflection. Once the carriage had disappeared down the drive, Alexander turned to Charlotte, his earlier warmth returning, though tinged now with something more guarded. You are not obligated to entertain his attentions, he said, not on my account, and not on your family's. I have no intention of entertaining them, Charlotte said firmly. Whatever Mr. Caro imagines about my circumstances, I make my own choices regarding my future. Relief flickered across Alexander's features before he schooled his expression back into careful neutrality, though Charlotte caught the glimpse of it clearly enough to feel her own chest warm with quiet satisfaction. What neither of them noticed, standing together near the paddock fence as the afternoon light softened toward evening, was the figure watching them from an upstairs window of the main house, Lord Cedric Ashworth, a distant cousin of Alexander's who had arrived unannounced 2 days earlier under the guise of a family visit, observed the entire exchange with calculating interest. Cedric had spent the better part of a year quietly maneuvering to secure his own position within the family's fortune, having grown deeply indebted through poor investments and worse company, and he had arrived at the estate specifically hoping to arrange an advantageous match between Alexander and a wealthy heiress whose family had already expressed interest in strengthening ties with the Ashworth name. A penniless stable girl with a ruined family reputation threatened every careful plan Cedric had spent months constructing. He watched Alexander's unguarded expression, the warmth he directed toward Charlotte Whitmore, and felt his jaw tighten with calculated frustration. This would require intervention, and soon, before whatever was growing between his cousin and that girl became impossible to unravel. That evening, Cedric wrote a careful letter, its contents designed to plant seeds of doubt and scandal that would, within days, blossom into a crisis threatening to unravel everything Charlotte and Alexander had built together in the quiet, hopeful weeks since her arrival at the estate. The letter arrived at the estate 5 days later, addressed not to Alexander but to Lady Beatrice, who read its contents twice before summoning her nephew to the study with an urgency that left no room for delay. It claims, Lady Beatrice said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, that Miss Whitmore was seen in London 18 months ago, engaged in an improper arrangement with a married gentleman of some standing, and that her family's ruin was not simply the result of her father's poor business dealings, but of a broader pattern of dishonesty running through the entire family. The letter is unsigned, but it claims to come from a reliable source close to the Whitmore household. Alexander read the letter himself, his expression darkening with each line. This is fabricated. Charlotte was never in London 18 months ago. She was here, in the county, caring for her mother. Can you prove that, Alexander? Because if this letter finds its way beyond this room, and I have reason to believe copies have already been sent elsewhere, the damage to her reputation, and to yours by association, will be significant. You cannot simply declare it false and expect society to accept your word over written accusations, however baseless they might be. Alexander's hands tightened around the paper. Who would write such a thing? Does it matter? What matters is what you intend to do about it. He knew, even as his aunt spoke, that the answer to her first question mattered a great deal, though he could not yet prove his growing suspicion that Cedric's sudden interest in extending his visit, and his frequent, overly curious questions about Charlotte over the past several days, were connected to this sudden and convenient scandal. He found Charlotte in the stable that evening, her expression already tight with worry before he said a single word, and he understood immediately that the rumors had already reached her. "They are saying I was some man's mistress in London," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her obvious effort to remain composed. "That my family's ruin came from more than my father's mistakes. People who once merely avoided me are now crossing the street entirely, rather than risk being seen near me." "It is a lie," Alexander said firmly. "I know it is a lie, and I intend to discover who is responsible for spreading it." "Does it matter who spread it, when everyone has already decided to believe it?" Charlotte's composure finally cracked, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though she fought fiercely to hold them back. "This is what happens to women like me, Alexander. We are given no benefit of the doubt, no presumption of innocence. A single unsigned letter is enough to undo everything I have worked to build here, everything I hoped might finally allow my family to recover." Alexander stepped closer, wanting desperately to offer comfort, but before he could speak, Lady Beatrice's voice carried sharply from the stable entrance. "Alexander, a word, if you please, now." He found his aunt waiting with an expression of grave seriousness he had rarely seen from her. "The situation has grown more complicated. Miss Whitmore's presence here, combined with these accusations, threatens not only her reputation, but the standing of this entire family. I have received word that Lord Pemberton, whose daughter has long been considered a suitable match for you, has heard the rumors and expressed concern about associating his family with this scandal. Given your apparent closeness with Miss Whitmore, I have no interest in Lord Pemberton's daughter." "Your interests are not the only consideration, Alexander. This family's future, its standing, its ability to recover fully from the shadow your brother's death cast over our name, depends on careful decisions now, not reckless ones driven by momentary affection for a woman whose reputation, however unfairly, has become a liability." Alexander felt the walls of duty and expectation closing in around him, the same suffocating pressure he had felt every day since inheriting the title from his brother, the constant weight of responsibility to a family name larger than his own individual happiness. He thought of Edward, who had always laughed at such constraints, who had lived freely despite the expectations placed upon him. But Edward was gone, and the full weight of the Ashworth legacy now rested on Alexander alone. "What would you have me do?" he asked quietly, though he already feared the answer his aunt would provide. "Send her away, quietly, before this scandal grows any larger. Provide her family whatever financial support you feel is warranted for her work with the horse, and let the matter end there, before it costs you everything you have worked to rebuild since Edward's death." That night, torn between the steady pull of duty and the unfamiliar ache of genuine affection, Alexander made a choice that would haunt him in the days that followed. He summoned Charlotte to his study, and though every instinct screamed against the words forming in his throat, he forced himself to speak them regardless. "I think it would be best," he said, unable to meet her eyes directly, "if you concluded your work with Tempest earlier than planned. I will ensure you receive the full reward regardless, but given the circumstances, I believe distance would serve both our reputations." Charlotte stood very still, absorbing the words slowly, watching the man who had held her so gently just days earlier now retreat behind a wall of cold formality she recognized all too well from their very first meeting. "I see," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled despite the devastation clearly building behind her eyes. "So this is how it ends, not with honesty, but with convenient distance, the moment my presence becomes inconvenient to your family's reputation." "Charlotte, it is not that simple." "It is exactly that simple," she said, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself, forcing calm back into her tone. "I told you why I came here. I told you what my family has already lost, how carefully I have guarded what little remains of our name. And now, faced with the first real test of whether you value me beyond convenient companionship in your stable, you choose duty and rumor over truth. That is unfair. Is it? Because from where I stand, Your Grace, it seems entirely fair." She turned toward the door, pausing only long enough to deliver one final, quiet blow. "I believed, foolishly it seems, that you were different from every other person who decided who I was based on gossip rather than truth. I was wrong. I hope your family's reputation brings you the comfort that honesty apparently could not." She left without waiting for his response, and Alexander sat alone in his study long into the night, the weight of his decision settling over him like a stone, heavier with each passing hour, until finally, near dawn, he understood with painful clarity exactly what he had sacrificed in his effort to protect a name that suddenly felt far less important than the woman he had just driven away. Charlotte packed her small bag the following morning, preparing to leave the county entirely rather than remain somewhere her presence had brought nothing but scandal and heartbreak. Her mother watched with quiet concern as Charlotte moved through their small cottage with mechanical efficiency, folding clothes she had barely had time to unpack from her weeks of daily travel to the estate. "You do not have to leave, Charlotte." "I cannot stay somewhere that has decided I am nothing more than a rumor to be managed," Charlotte said, her voice hollow with exhaustion and heartbreak she refused to fully express, even to her own mother. "We will go to your sister's home in the north. There is nothing left for us here." Outside, unseen by either woman, a storm was beginning to gather on the horizon, dark clouds rolling in from the west with a speed that promised violence before the day was through, a fitting mirror for the turmoil still churning, unresolved, between Charlotte Whitmore and the Duke who had let duty silence what his heart had only just begun to understand. The storm broke just after noon, rain hammering against the stable roof with a violence that set every horse in the Ashworth stables on edge. Tempest, who had grown calm and steady over the past weeks under Charlotte's careful guidance, began pacing his stall the moment the first crack of thunder rolled across the estate, his old fear resurfacing without her steady presence to anchor him. Hale tried to calm the animal, speaking in the same low tones he had watched Charlotte use so effectively, but Tempest did not know him the way he knew her, and the horse's panic only grew with each passing minute. When a second, closer strike of thunder shook the stable walls, Tempest reared hard enough to splinter the stall's wooden gate, and before Hale could react, the stallion bolted out into the storm, hooves pounding across the muddy grounds toward the open countryside beyond the estate's boundary. Word reached Alexander within minutes, and he abandoned his study without a second thought, calling for his own horse to be saddled despite the driving rain and the danger of riding in such conditions. Lady Beatrice attempted to stop him at the door, insisting the groundskeepers could manage the search, but Alexander brushed past her with a determination that left no room for argument. "That horse trusts one person in this world," he said, already pulling on his riding coat, "and I have just driven her away." He rode hard through the storm, following the direction Hale indicated Tempest had fled, his mind consumed not only with worry for the horse, but with a clarity that had been building since the previous night's sleepless hours, a clarity that finally cut through every careful argument his aunt and his sense of duty had constructed. He had spent 8 months since Edward's death building walls around himself, mistaking cold control for strength, mistaking family duty for the only measure of a worthy life. Charlotte had cracked those walls without even trying, simply by refusing to be diminished by circumstances beyond her control, by facing every obstacle with the same quiet, unshakable dignity that had first caught his attention on the day she walked through his gates uninvited. He found Tempest nearly 2 miles from the estate, cornered against a fallen tree at the edge of the forest, still trembling with fear but no longer running, as though some instinct had told him this was as far as flight could carry him. Alexander approached slowly, exactly as Charlotte had taught him, speaking low and steady despite the storm raging around them both. "Easy," he murmured, closing the distance carefully. I know you are frightened. She is not here to calm you, and that is my fault, not yours." It took nearly 20 minutes of patient, careful approach before Tempest allowed Alexander close enough to catch his lead rope, and by the time he finally secured the frightened animal, both horse and rider were soaked through, exhausted, and covered in mud. But as Alexander led Tempest back toward the estate, walking rather than riding out of respect for the horse's continued distress, his mind was already turning toward a different destination entirely. He arrived at the Whitmore cottage just as evening fell, the storm finally beginning to ease into a steady drizzle, his appearance disheveled and entirely unlike the composed Duke who typically commanded every room he entered. Charlotte's mother answered the door, her eyes widening with surprise at the sight of him standing on their modest doorstep, mud streaked across his coat and rain still dripping from his hair. "Your Grace," she said, clearly uncertain how to address the situation. "I am afraid Charlotte is not receiving visitors this evening." "Please," Alexander said, his voice carrying none of its usual authority, only quiet, desperate honesty. "I made a mistake, a significant one, and I need the chance to correct it before she leaves for good." Behind her mother, Charlotte appeared in the narrow hallway, her expression guarded but unable to fully hide the surprise, and beneath it, the flicker of hope she had tried so hard to extinguish since the previous night. "Alexander," she said carefully, using his given name for what felt like the final time. "You should not have come." "I should have come sooner," he said, stepping past her mother's hesitant welcome into the small, warm cottage. "I let my aunt's fears and my own long-held habit of prioritizing duty over honesty convince me that sending you away would protect this family's reputation. I was wrong, and I have spent every hour since regretting it. Words are simple to offer, Alexander. I need more than words. Then let me show you rather than tell you." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, the very letter that had begun this entire crisis. "I know who wrote this. My cousin Cedric has spent weeks maneuvering to secure his own financial future through an advantageous match he hoped I would make, one that had nothing to do with genuine affection, and everything to do with his own desperate debts. He fabricated every accusation in this letter, and I confronted him this evening before riding here. He has already confessed, in writing, before witnesses, and will be leaving the estate permanently before morning." Charlotte took the paper with trembling hands, reading Cedric's shaky, guilt-ridden confession, understanding finally the full scope of the scheme that had nearly destroyed everything she had worked to build. You confronted him, tonight, in this storm. I would have confronted him at any hour, in any weather, the moment I understood what he had done to you. Alexander stepped closer, his voice softening further. Charlotte, I spent 8 months since my brother's death believing that duty and control were the only things holding this family together, the only measure of my worth as the man who inherited a title I never wanted, under circumstances I never chose. You taught me, without either of us intending it, that duty without honesty is simply another kind of cowardice. I let my family's reputation silence what I knew, in my heart, to be true the moment I saw you standing in my stable yard, refusing to be dismissed. And what is that truth? Charlotte asked quietly, though her eyes already shone with unshed tears that carried far more hope than sorrow. That I love you, Alexander said simply, the words unpracticed and entirely genuine. That I have loved you since you stood in my stables with mud on your hem, and refused to back down from a man who had given you every reason to leave. That Tempest broke free from his stall today, because he trusts you completely, and I understand that trust entirely, because I have come to trust you more than I have trusted anyone since my brother died. Charlotte's mother, sensing the moment required privacy, quietly withdrew into the kitchen, leaving the two of them alone in the small hallway, rain still tapping gently against the windows outside. You hurt me, Charlotte said, though the anger in her voice had softened considerably. Deeply. I know. And I do not expect forgiveness simply because I have finally found the courage to be honest. But I am asking for the chance to earn it, however long that might take. Charlotte studied him for a long, quiet moment, weighing the pain of the previous night against the raw honesty standing before her now, mud-streaked and vulnerable in a way she had never seen the composed Duke allow himself to be. Finally she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Tempest bolted because of the storm, she said softly. Not because he no longer trusted anyone. Sometimes fear makes even the steadiest hearts run, before they remember what they are running from. Are you speaking of the horse, or of yourself? Perhaps both, Charlotte admitted, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her guarded expression. I do not forgive easily, Alexander, but I understand fear, and I understand the courage it takes to turn back toward what frightens us most, rather than running further away. Alexander reached for her hand, and this time, she did not pull away. 3 weeks passed before Charlotte returned to the Ashworth estate, though this time she arrived not as a woman seeking a reward, but as a guest invited openly, her presence no longer whispered about in shadows but acknowledged plainly by every member of the household, from Hale at the stables to Lady Beatrice, who had, somewhat reluctantly, begun to soften toward her nephew's choice once Cedric's deception became public knowledge throughout the county. Cedric himself had left before dawn on the night of his confession, his debts and schemes exposed thoroughly enough that no drawing room in the region would receive him again. The scandal that had nearly destroyed Charlotte's reputation instead settled firmly onto the man who created it, and slowly, gradually, the whispers that had once followed Charlotte through the village began to shift into something closer to admiration for the woman who had tamed the Duke's wildest horse and, as more than a few townspeople now joked, tamed the Duke himself in the process. Tempest greeted Charlotte at the paddock fence with an eager whinny the moment she appeared, nudging his nose against her shoulder with an affection that made Alexander, watching from a short distance, smile in a way that had become far more frequent since that rain-soaked evening at the Whitmore cottage. He missed you, Alexander said, joining her at the fence. I missed him as well, Charlotte admitted, running her hand along the stallion's neck, though I suspect he was not the only one counting the days. No, Alexander agreed. He was not. Their courtship, once it began properly, moved with a steadiness that surprised even Lady Beatrice, who had expected further scandal given how unconventionally the relationship had started. Alexander called on the Whitmore cottage regularly, always with proper chaperonage, always with the quiet respect Charlotte had come to expect from him since his honest confession in the rain. Her mother, initially wary of a duke's intentions toward her daughter, found herself won over gradually by Alexander's consistent kindness, his genuine interest in Charlotte's thoughts and opinions, rather than simply her usefulness with difficult horses. Word spread through the county of the unlikely match, and while a few old voices continued to mutter about propriety and suitable stations, far more people found themselves quietly rooting for the couple, having witnessed firsthand the transformation both had undergone since Charlotte first walked through the estate gates. The Duke, once known primarily for his cold, guarded temperament since his brother's death, had grown visibly warmer, more patient with his staff, more willing to laugh openly rather than retreating behind careful formality. And Charlotte, who had spent 2 years believing her family's ruin defined her entirely, walked now with the quiet confidence of a woman who had proven, through patience and unshakable dignity, that her worth had never depended on anyone else's opinion. 6 months after that stormy night, Alexander proposed to Charlotte in the same paddock where Tempest had first accepted a saddle beneath her careful hands, kneeling in the same grass where he had first watched her transform a wild, grieving animal into something calm and trusting once more. "I once believed," he said, holding her hands in his, "that duty and love could not coexist, that protecting my family's name meant sacrificing genuine happiness. You proved me wrong in every possible way. You did not just tame a horse that everyone else had given up on. You reminded me what it means to be honest, to choose courage over convenient distance, to build a life on truth rather than fear of scandal." Charlotte, tears gathering in her eyes though her smile remained steady, did not hesitate before answering, "I came to your estate seeking a reward large enough to save my family from ruin. I never imagined I would leave having found something far more valuable than money could ever provide." Their wedding took place the following spring, a modest but joyful occasion that drew guests from across the county, including many who had once whispered cruel rumors about Charlotte's family, now eager to witness the union that had become something of a local legend. Charlotte's mother wept openly throughout the ceremony, overwhelmed by relief at seeing her daughter's future finally secured, not through desperate necessity but through genuine love freely given and received. Tempest, decorated for the occasion with ribbons woven through his mane, stood calmly at the edge of the estate grounds throughout the celebration, a quiet testament to the patience and honesty that had brought Charlotte and Alexander together in the first place. Hale, watching the ceremony from a respectful distance, remarked to another groom that he had never in all his years expected to see that particular horse standing so peacefully amid such a large, noisy crowd, a transformation he attributed entirely to the steady woman who had refused to give up on him. In the years that followed, Charlotte became known throughout the county not merely as the Duchess of Ashworth, but as a woman deeply involved in the management of the estate's stables, working alongside Hale to train horses that other households had deemed unmanageable, offering the same patient methods that had first won Tempest's trust to countless other animals whose owners had given up hope. Alexander, meanwhile, grew into his role as Duke with a warmth and fairness that earned him genuine respect throughout the region, his earlier coldness replaced by the steady confidence of a man who had learned, through hard experience, that true strength required honesty rather than rigid control. Lady Beatrice, in time, became one of Charlotte's staunchest allies, admitting privately to her nephew that she had never seen him happier than in the years following his marriage, and that whatever doubts she had once harbored about Charlotte's suitability had long since dissolved in the face of her evident devotion, both to Alexander and to the estate she had come to consider home. Edmund Caro, having failed to secure Charlotte's attention, eventually married elsewhere, though he was occasionally heard to remark, with a touch of wistfulness, that he had recognized something remarkable in Charlotte Whitmore the very day he met her, though he had never quite managed to compete with the quiet devotion the Duke of Ashworth so clearly held for her. Charlotte often returned, in quiet moments, to that first difficult day, when she had walked through the Ashworth gates with nothing but determination and mud on her hem, uncertain whether she would be laughed away before she had the chance to prove herself. She thought of the wild, grieving horse that had greeted her with fear and fury, and of the equally guarded man who had stood watching, certain she would fail exactly as everyone before her had failed. Neither the horse nor the man had been easy to reach, but patience, she had learned, was rarely about speed. It was about presence, about refusing to abandon something simply because progress came slowly, about trusting that steady, honest care could soften even the most guarded hearts, given enough time and enough courage to stay through the storm rather than run from it. Standing now in the same stable where it had all begun, watching her husband lead their young daughter toward Tempest's stall for her very first riding lesson, Charlotte allowed herself a quiet, contented smile. The stallion, aged now but still spirited, lowered his head gently to greet the small girl reaching eagerly toward him, as calm and trusting as he had ever been under Charlotte's careful hand all those years ago. "Gently," Alexander instructed their daughter, his voice carrying the same patient warmth Charlotte had first glimpsed in him during those early, uncertain weeks. "Let him come to you. Never force it. The best things in life, little one, are rarely won through force. They are earned through patience and honesty and the courage to stay when it would be easier to walk away." Charlotte watched them both, her heart full with a happiness she had once believed impossible for a woman whose family name had been dragged so thoroughly through scandal and ruin. She thought of every closed door, Every whispered rumor, every desperate night spent counting coins by candlelight, and understood now that none of it had been wasted. It had all led her here, to this stable, to this man, to this life built not on convenient reputation but on genuine, hard-won truth. The wild stallion had been tamed, yes, but so too had the impatient duke who once ordered a stranger off his land, transformed by patience and honesty into a man capable of choosing love over fear, truth over convenient duty, and a future built on trust rather than the empty comfort of careful, guarded distance.